Hola, ¿cómo están, my compañeros? Let me share with you a little bit of bad news. I wanted to really let other people know what critical race studies is and see how it equates to the logic of life. This is what she says. She says it's the most. She says critical race studies are the most important tradition to come out of the school of law in the past 50 years. She goes on to say that there's a large diversity in critical race theory, but then she goes on after that and says, but we all think the exact same thing.
Is the most exciting intellectual tradition emerging in the legal academy in the past 50 years, and that is critical race theory. Critical race theory is a broad and diverse field, and there's great diversity within that field, but there's also consensus about three core ideas that I want to share with you right now by way of introduction to the field. So number one, that law has been used both to perpetuate and ameliorate white supremacy. Number two, that law's adherence to neutrality, especially in the law today, continues to exacerbate racial oppression. And number three, the idea that racism in America is endemic rather than aberrational. So let me just say a few words about each. Law has historically been one of the most important mechanisms for protecting white supremacy in terms of white economic and political domination. Certainly this is visible in the nation's founding documents, from the protection of slaveholders via the Fugitive Slave Act and the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution. It is enshrined in cases like Dred Scott, which was overruled by the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. It is enshrined in cases like Korematsu.
What did she just say? Did she say Dred Scott got overturned by the 14th Amendment? Is that what she said? So, is that not something beneficial?
Case that was only recently overruled in Trump v. Hawaii, the case upholding the Muslim travel ban. And in cases like Plessy versus Ferguson, not overturned until 56 years later in Brown versus Board of Education. Law has been, and still is, an essential tool in our fight against racial inequality.
Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. That separate is inherently unequal. That's where they can't have segregated classrooms because it's inherently unequal. And they're trying to turn that over. Critical race theory tries to say that that's not even a good thing.
Justice, such as it was during Reconstruction itself and during the so-called Second Reconstruction, when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed only because of protest, mass protest by African Americans and their allies in the 1960s. Today, laws adherence to neutrality.
I just want to make the point that the civil rights legislation passed through Congress thanks to the Republican body. It had nothing, not one single Democrat voted for the civil rights legislation or the one that followed up.
Mass protest by African Americans and their allies.
It was America. It was.
Today, law's adherence to neutrality masks the ways in which law undermines its own liberational potential. One example is the judge-made constitutional doctrine
hang on, let me
that
see.
Which law undermines its own liberational potential.
What?
Today, law's adherence to neutrality masks the ways in which law undermines its own liberational potential.
She just said that whenever we want to be neutral, I bet she's going to say when we want to be neutral, our inherent bias takes over, which is, it's nonsensical, because if she's saying that, then she can't even believe the words coming out of her own mouth.
To neutrality masks the ways in which law undermines its own liberational potential. One example is the judge-made constitutional doctrine that all government uses of race are suspect, whether or not they were intended to promote or ameliorate racial subordination, such as affirmative action. In a series of 1980s and 1990s cases, the Supreme Court entrenched this doctrine, effectively short-circuiting that second Reconstruction a mere decades after it had begun. A third and final CRT tenet is that racism is endemic, not aberrational.
I think what she's saying, that second point right here, she's saying that when people try to be neutral, that it messes up. I don't think that any of our current laws are a representation of that. I think that critical race theory is a representation of when people try to be extra fair, they actually are very biased.
In the 80s and 1990s cases, the Supreme Court entrenched this doctrine, effectively short-circuiting that second Reconstruction a mere decades after it had begun. A third and final CRT tenet is that racism is endemic, not aberrational. CRT thus rejects the notion that there are bad apples. This is particularly trotted out at the current moment in the context of the police killings in recent months. In a recent NPR interview, the nation's top lawyer, Attorney General William Barr, argued.
Sometimes I wonder if she believes the stuff coming out of her mouth. She just, I mean,
there are bad apples.
She says there are no bad apples.
This is particularly trotted out at the current moment in the context of the police killings in recent months.
She just did say there are no bad apples, but she does say there are no bad apples. It just cut off there.
Recent NPR interview, the nation's top lawyer, Attorney General William Barr, argued we had failed to put these recent killings in perspective. He emphasized that in 2019, there were only 10 police killings of unarmed black men.
What was
Apparently,
the quotes
he was not
for?
bothered by the hundreds of other killings of black women, of other people of color, of those who might have had.
Well, women aren't men.
Black men. Apparently, he was not bothered by the hundreds of other killings of black women, of other people of color, of those who might have had a weapon but did not deserve a death sentence. But that was not the only point he made. He compared police killings to what he termed black-on-black violence, which he claimed accounted for 85% of the homicides of African Americans in 2019.
That statistic is correct. Black-on-black crime accounts for a large majority of the violence in the black community. The same is true for white-on-white crime in the white community and Hispanic-on-Hispanic crime in the Hispanic community. We commit crimes within the races.
Up this way, quote, I think it is wrong to demonize all the police and all the police departments as, systematically racist. I think America was making a lot of progress on race. I mean, we elected Barack Obama president, end quote. CRT scholars categorically reject Barr's formulation. Instead, we understand deadly police encounters as the predictable byproduct of entrenched racial subordination. Racism that determines the parameters of police discretion in the face of differently racialized bodies and in the context of ingrained race, class, residential segregation that overdetermines police decisions about whom to stop, whom to arrest, as well as when to use deadly force.
It was not. There was the other thing she said. It's class and all these other things that also come into play when they stop people. I love her face.
Differently racialized bodies, and in the context of ingrained race, class, residential segregation that overdetermines police decisions about whom to stop, whom to arrest, as well as when to use deadly force. Just as it overdetermines prosecutors' discretion to file charges based on their assessment about whether they can win cases of excessive force, given the makeup of jury pools, and given judge-made law that systematically favors defendants who are cops. Armed with this central tenet, the removal of a few bad cops won't solve a problem that is historically and institutionally entrenched, not only in every facet of the legal system, but in every facet of American life. With that introduction to critical race theory,
she just implied that they are trying to abolish the police force. Is that not what this professor, this intelligent, educated woman just implied? That she implied that if she calls the police, that them coming and helping her is somehow inherently racist.
Not only in every facet of the legal system, but in every facet of American life. With that introduction to critical race theory, I'd like to turn now to the best part, which is introducing.
I'll include the link if you want to keep looking.